As part of their enduring commitment to justice, equity, and expression, the Open Society Foundations are proud to sponsor Many Lumens. You're listening to Many Lumens, where we talk about and find meaning in the intersections of art, social change, and popular culture. I'm your host, Maori Karmael Holmes. For this episode, I'm joined by Princeton African American Studies professor Imani Perry. Imani is one of my favorite writers and humans. In addition to teaching, she's a mom, a contributor to The Atlantic, a mentor, and an avid collector. She's written 8 books. Her first one, Prophets of the Hood, Politics and Poetics in Hip Hop, came out in 2004, followed by More Beautiful and More Terrible, The Embrace and Transcendence of Racial Inequality in the United States. Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant and Radical Life of Lorraine Hansberry. May We Forever Stand, A History of the Black National Anthem. Vexy Thing, on Gender and Liberation. Breathe, A Letter to My Sons, and of course her most recent, South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation. To call her prolific is an understatement. In this episode, we discuss our shared geographic connections and the manner in which the places we belong to have shaped who we've become. We get into Imani's commitment to beauty, and we talk about her family, the intellectual tradition she inherited from her grandmother, and finally, Imani and I bond over being migrant weirdos. I think I've told you before, and I will embarrass you now, you're one of my favorite writers, and so it means a lot to have you on the show. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you're one of my favorite people.
Humans.
That's what I was going to say, too.
That's mutual. Yes.
You do work a lot, and I know that is a serious pot kettle statement, but I'm curious.
Yeah, right. Right. Really, you think?
You're a full-time professor, you're speaking, doing informal and formal editing of other people's content. You have a newsletter in The Atlantic, and then somehow there have been years when there's 2 books coming out. How do you do this?
Well, one is that I work on a lot of things at the same time. Something, a habit you might be familiar with.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
So I think actually because some people I think work on one thing and then they're struggling. So One Year I did have 3 books come out in that year, but I had worked on all of them for 7 years. So I think that's a piece of it. And it's also has been when you have been sort of dreaming and scheming and thinking and imagining for years, and then you finally get to the place where you can do these things, there's a rush where you're like, oh, now's my chance. I can do all. Okay, here we go.
I understand that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
You have a bunch of degrees.
I do.
I stan. I'm curious what drew you to them and in the order in which you received them. What were you imagining in high school that led you down this path? Because I feel like you also achieved them pretty young. So if you could just very briefly walk us through the Imani Perry education trajectory.
All right. So I went to college and went to Yale and started out wanting to be a math major. And 2 things happened. One is I wound up in this American Studies course, and they were talking about Senegambians' rice cultivation techniques in South Carolina being responsible for the South Carolina colony existing and being able to sustain itself. And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And so then I had to major in that. And then I was in this literature course, and they were talking about Freud's theory of Unheimlich and the uncanny. And I was fascinated by the idea of something being uncanny. So then as I got a major in that, and I loved Latin American literature. So I was like, let me concentrate in that. And so it was just sort of I fell in love with stuff. When I was applying, I had decided I thought I wanted to be a professor, but I had a vision of being a professor that was very different from the reality. So I just need to say that. Mm-hmm. But then the Lani Guinier thing happened. And that was when Bill Clinton nominated Guinier to be Attorney General. And then all of these people flipped out because she had thought of innovative ways of changing the voting system in order to ensure more Black representation. And then they both attacked her ideas. They attacked the way she looked, her natural hair. They called her a witch, all this stuff. And then I was like, oh, I got to go to law school because I want to make white folks mad like that. As literally was the thought process. And then it was the end of the fall semester, my senior year. And I told my parents I was applying to law school because I wanted to be like Lonnie Guinier. And then I was like, I don't feel like it. And they were like, what are you talking about? I was like, I don't feel like applying to anything else. I'm tired. And then they, went on the tired. That's not how you make life decisions, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, fine, I'll apply to one law school, which was Harvard Law School. But then when I got in, I was like, well, maybe I can just do both because I didn't, my mother would say to me, she's like, there's no need to get out of school. All there is work for the rest of your life. Right. I didn't feel like I needed money. Like I really I was really good with being tight with money when I was in school. So then I went to a PhD program, did my first 2 years, and then I started law school, did a year of law school, and then I went back. So I was writing my dissertation and finishing law school at the same time. I was 27 when I graduated with my PhD in law school. Then I went into a program at Georgetown that prepared people to be law professors, but they gave you a degree at the end of it, which is an LLM. And so, yeah. So that was the trajectory.
It's kind of incredible. I mean, just even that you could do these things simultaneously it says so much about what you continue to do. I know that you also love art, and you're someone who has been collecting even before you really could collect, right? It seemed like it was a personal mandate. Oh, yeah. And I'm curious, where did that come from? Like, how did you know that it was important to buy art, even just like for yourself?
Yeah. In some ways, it's kind of visceral. I loved art. And I met this man at Union Station in D.C. in 1999. And I had always thought that original art, I say, was just for rich people. Mm-hmm. So I would have poster versions of fine art. And I met this man in Union Station who worked as a garbage collector. And he started to tell me about how he collected Black art. And he was telling me stories of finding things at yard sales and buying things when he was very young. And he was an older man. And he was telling me sort of the process. And he was about like when people didn't really value Black art. And of course, back then it wasn't anywhere like it is now. And I started to think about, one, how beautiful it was that this man had invested in Black artists, but also that original art didn't have to be the province of the wealthy, because it really was just about encountering art that moved you, right? And deciding that out of your disposable income, that was something that mattered to you. I also had an experience of going to someone's house, her apartment, and there's very little in the apartment and her bed was on the floor, but there were these big, massive paintings on the wall and virtually nothing else. And I was like, I would never need a piece of furniture if I could live like this. Yeah.
There's this line from Erykah Badu's And On where she says, what good do your words do if they can't understand you, right? And one of the things that I so appreciate about your writing is that it is exceptionally rigorous. And then it's also accessible. And so I'm just curious, who is the audience when you're writing? Are you thinking about it being broadly accessible? Are you not thinking about any of that?
I never think about accessibility, but I believe in quality writing. Toni Morrison is absolutely one of my favorites. I had to read Beloved 3 times to understand what was going on, right? And so it was difficult. I'm not against difficulty, but I kept trying because it was so beautiful and profound. So I don't think about accessibility as much as I want it to be worth, if and when it's hard, I want it to be worth the work. And I want the words to speak, even if the meaning has to take some time to unfold. There are people who say, well, you write for Black people. And I do, but I really write for everybody. Mm-hmm. But I think what people are feeling is that my first consideration is Black people. And I don't even mean that as audience, but as human beings.
Right.
There's a centeredness there that I think is communicated in ways that feel as loving, or I'm hoping they feel as loving as it is. And so I do tend to think about people who are in that like 18 to 25 age range a lot, only because I'm like, they're stepping into a shit show of a world. And then we want them to save us. But again, I write for everybody, but I'm like trying to think, okay, what does an 18-year-old need from me is always a question as I'm writing, which isn't, I have an 18-year-old. This is sort of funny now because I've been writing it for a long time, and now I have someone that age. So he can actually tell me a lot about what speaks to him in the writing and what doesn't, which is helpful.
Mm. So do you have your kids read your work before you finish?
Sometimes, if they're willing.
Yeah.
I talk to them a lot about the work, a lot. We talk about writing in general, though. We talk about the things each of us write to each other, which is interesting. It's funny. I don't think I've ever said that before to anyone in public, but that's true. We talk a lot about writing, but they tell me about what writing matters to them. Both of them have pushed me to write fiction, which one day I will. Yeah.
I'm very excited for that. Well, this is a lovely segue. Speaking of fiction, you wrote an amazing book about Lorraine Hansberry, who's someone that we don't often, but probably should consider an icon of youth culture. Yes. And in Looking for Lorraine, you present an intimate and beautiful composition of her rather than a biography. Why is this distinction important to you? Like, what does it mean to have catching a likeness of her? Yeah, was supposed to be.
I was thinking about one of the terms I use is third person memoir. And I was thinking about how memoir settles into themes rather than cradle to grave. Like when I started, I was really interested in why doesn't she have her rightful place? And then as I worked on it, I thought, she was relatively invisible. That has changed a lot. Tracy Strain's film, Sighted Eyes, Feeling Heart, is just, I think, incredible. And that has been a big part of the transformation. And then Soyika Colbert's biography, which came out as well. And so I think that, she has a story that is relevant for today in so many ways. She's an artist. She struggled with depression. She was queer. She struggled with the complexities of not being fully recognized by her community. She experienced a disability because for several years she didn't know that she was dying, and she had some sort of significant political disagreements with her family. And so she had this life that is so resonant, I think, for young people today. And that's what I wanted. I wanted to sort of think about how her life could become something that is meaningful for us as we navigate this moment, and not just let me tell you why she mattered. The other piece was that Margaret Wilkerson, who has been working on a Hansberry biography for years, and I knew I was not going to write something that was in competition with the work that she's doing, but rather trying to focus on what is the thing that I, with my particular set of experiences, can illuminate about her life. And so that, and it was really a beautiful process because there was this community of Black women, all of us working on Hansberry in our different ways and trying to support each other and sharing materials. And that is so contrary to the way both the writing and the academic world tend to work, that it was really, really great. And so that's both the community and also what my priorities were with the project that led me to craft it in the way that I did.
I want to move on a little bit. I want to come back to family, but in Breathe, a letter to my sons, you write that you live for the life of the mind and heart. Can you explain what this means a little bit more? And I want to ask you if are the mind and heart in conflict? Are they in lockstep? What does this mean?
Yeah. I don't think the mind and the heart are in conflict. I do think the academic and the heart are in conflict. I have, by profession, I have been a professor for a long time, and yet I still struggle with that as a definition for me. It's not that it's not true, but there's something that like kind of, I don't know, like something sticks in my craw. I have a strong sense of myself as an intellectual in terms of living the life of the mind. I love to read. I love ideas. I love art. I love the sort of quest for meaning and truth and all that stuff. And I also deeply love beauty and love. And for me, those things all have to go together. I think the thing that I am resisting is the dissociation that is so much part of what an academic life consists of between the heart, the feeling self, and the intellectual self, and also the professionalism and the construction of what matters is something that I really have a hard time with, especially now as academia has become so cruel. Mm. When I was a teenager, the Brazilian intellectual Paulo Freire, he used to come when we lived in Massachusetts, used to come to town occasionally for events, and we'd go to dinners with him and like he'd talk, and I was so totally in awe. And I remember thinking, he's the first professor I knew who talked about food and beauty with the same relish as he talked about like socialist theory and critical pedagogy. And I was like, that's the thing, like for me, right? Like, so the interdisciplinarity piece is more about sort of bringing all the aspects, not just of myself, but about what I think is important about being a person in the world together.
Where does that interest in beauty come from? Is that your astrology? Is that your mother?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's certainly my family. Mm-hmm. And, especially when it comes to like clothes and like shoes and this sort of this pleasure, taking pleasure in, material culture. And like, I went to the art museum a lot with my dad, which was really, what was interesting about it, I didn't realize it until he was near the end of his life, is that like, he's sort of, and he identified as a communist, and he was like he's a public health researcher, like not, and, so in his world, that kind of stuff, visual arts and even theater were a little sort of considered, I think, a little bourgeois, but he used to take me to plays all the time and to art museums all the time. And he taught me about modern art, and nobody else in his life knew that he was interested in these things. Like nobody, and also I just love being moved emotionally, like all the kinds of beauty that are like sublime, that can take you over, that can captivate you. I'm hooked on all that stuff. So maybe it's partly astrological. Maybe it's the Leo in me. I don't know. You have to tell me. I don't know.
And I love that, also thinking about your father's kind of secret affinity for the arts, because I think some of the people who I've become closest to are people I met in social justice space, and we secretly would shop afterwards,
Yes! It makes sense.
Yeah.
Right? It's so sad that it's seen, because like, you seek the beloved community, you seek harmony, you seek there's so much that's about social justice, which is like being able to experience delight and joy freely, right? But we sort of, I don't know, Marx did a number on us. That's neither here nor there.
So speaking of being at odds, I had another question, which is thinking about what is expected of so-called Black girls, and how I sort of feel odd and out of place. And then when I meet you, I feel seen, right? And I'm like, oh, yes, like I'm not alone.
There's another Black girl like me. Yes, same.
Yeah. And also in Breathe, you have, you write, I want to continue in the strangeness that allows me to discover myself in others. And so I'm curious if you feel comfortable in your strangeness, and have you hoped for your children to be strange?
I have hoped desperately. They are satisfying me completely. I mean, my children will not pretend to like or care about things they don't like or care about. They are both artistic. Diallo is my older son is has been identified as artistic all along.
Mm-hmm.
And Issa was the athlete, but now he's an artist and he's taking photographs all over the place and he's taking these gorgeous portraits. And the thing that feels so good about it is not just that they're beautiful, but they are, but that the thing of being the identity that was placed upon him, is like an athlete. He is not being constrained by it. He's like,
Robeson.
I'm into this other thing. I'm not that into, I want them to understand that they are constantly becoming, and there's no boxes of any sort. I feel comfortable in my strangeness, in that, like, I think it's pretty pretty good assessment of myself, but I still feel as though there are ways that I am punished for it,
mm-hmm.
and the consequences of being misfitted. I definitely feel that. So it's like, I'm not willing to fit more easily. I'm not interested in any of this stuff, and I don't follow any of these rules. And this is clearly bothering people, but I can only be who I am. Yeah.
No, I totally experienced that. I don't know that I'm comfortable, but it's like I don't have a choice. So I'm trying to learn to be comfortable, like I might as well get comfortable.
Yeah.
And it was like, you don't have a choice. What are you doing?
Yeah. Yeah. There's always the risk, I think, when we're sort of different, right, or unconventional, that can turn into different and therefore superior. And so I think that to not take that position, especially when an adolescent, was important for the development of values. You know what I mean? Because I don't know, I'm glad that we did not become those types of people. That's basically the point. Yeah.
There's something for me that's coming up, though, that there's a kind of romance about what I'll say is like sort of air quote normal. And I feel like that's the thing that comes up, is this, like, in me, it's like a nostalgia for like what could have been if I were normal.
Oh yeah.
And that's such a waste of time.
I mean, I know exactly what you mean, because there's a little heartache attached to it, but the reality is that the cost is so high.
Yeah.
Because I had this experience a couple of years ago. I mean, I had it over many years, but that I realized a couple of years ago that as a professor, every student who came into my office to pour their hearts out, every single one would say, I don't fit in at every place I ever worked. And I was like, oh, because nobody really fits in, but most people try to, and that there's a deep cost to it. I mean, I don't mean nobody, there's degrees, but I began to realize that the cost of conformity is experienced probably by everyone. And the choice not to conform is to exchange one kind of pain for a kind of yearning, right?
Yeah.
And so until the world is different, that's probably just going to be the choice. Oh, which whatever.
There's a lot of, I think kinship that we have. And I was thinking about I had a conversation a couple of years ago with the filmmaker Imani Baker, who made the film House on Cocoa Road. And when I saw his film, I was able to articulate this feeling of coming from people with migration in the bones. And I know you and I share roots in Alabama, and I know you have roots in Louisiana and Massachusetts and, a couple of other places. And I was just curious what that phrasing means for you.
Yeah. So it's interesting for me because I often define myself as someone who doesn't come from a great migration family, because my family is still overwhelmingly in Alabama. I ran into Imani and his family in a train station in Japan a couple of years ago. And it is that thing, like this sense of like coming from, I would say, especially mothers who are seekers, and seekers in a way of like imagining one's life outside of the conventions for the generations before. And so even like, having mothers that kind of just take you where they're going as they look for freedom. But I would say I am grateful to be given a vision of what it meant to be a woman that was not bound to traditional notions of like what it means to live a good life or what it means to be decent. Like that the idea that you try and kind of find yourself and keep finding yourself is it not just a normal thing, but is a good thing. I'm so grateful for that. I'm so grateful for the idea that you can start over. I think as part of that, the importance of friendship and like community, not just because, you know, I come from a family, its family is super, super important, but also my mother had friends and I saw them and I cared about them and I stayed over the night at their houses. And sometimes people say, oh, that like actors, so it's a tragedy if you don't spend your life witnessing having parents who are partnered indefinitely. On the other hand, I think so often what people miss out is actually seeing parents as friends, like, and cultivating friendship. And that's something that I really, really appreciated, you know, because that's a big part of having a good life.
Yeah, that's really true. That chosen family. Mm-hmm. I also like this mothers as seekers, and I'm going to think about that a little bit more. Your friend, my mother will, yes, she will appreciate that.
BlackStar Projects celebrates and uplifts Black, Brown, and Indigenous artists. We produce the annual BlackStar Film Festival, many Lumens, Scene, and other projects, creating the spaces and resources artists need to thrive. Learn more and support our work at blackstarfest.org.
You're listening to Many Lumens. Now back to my interview with Imani Perry. I want to go back to thinking about you being born in Birmingham, raised in New England and the Midwest. You've definitely talked about cautioning against, you know, a simplistic reading of these as poles.
Yes.
But I'm also curious about how being raised in all these places, did it embed in you a sense of freedom just because you weren't in one place, or am I projecting?
I mean, I think there's a benefit without question. I mean, I moved like, okay, so here's a benefit. This is not going to seem, but like I was in a car in New Orleans and the driver picked me up and I'm talking to him and I was like, so are you from Honduras or Belize? It was a Black man. And he laughed and he's like, I'm from Honduras and my grandmother was from Belize. And I was like, and he just was sort of surprised that I could hear it. But I was like, I have an ear because of being in different places. I'm attentive because of being in those different places. I also think I know what I want because of being, you know, you do see different ways of living. I know what I want. I know what I like. So I guess that's the kind of freedom.
Yeah.
You know, to be able to imagine oneself and one's life broadly. There's a comfort, but also a confidence in moving into lots of different arenas that I know has to do with that.
I'm really curious about the geographic demarcations of the South. And you queer this a bit in South to America. I'm curious, where does the South begin and end for you? And what are those markers?
Right. Well, they've changed. But I will say when I moved to Philly and realized that they sell Jim Dandy grits at the Walmart, that was a really interesting moment. I mean, I think it's you know, the borders are porous and there are Souths plural. I used to really just think of the Deep South as South. And it was the Deep South excluding Atlanta, frankly, because that's the way I had been socialized to think of this. Like Atlanta was something sort of different, right? Mm-hmm. I no longer think that way. And that's partially because I know more about Atlanta and I also know more about the Upper South. Although last night I had on my way from Virginia, had a driver who was like, yeah, you know, they call us Southern, but you know, there ain't nothing like down there, like talking about Alabama, right? And so there's this sort of awareness that there are degrees of not just of Southernness, but the way in which the cultivation of the land and the conditions of human beings in relationship to the cultivation of the land shaped culture, right? And so I know I'm avoiding answering your question. I mean, the places where it gets hard to me are Oklahoma, Missouri. I've grown to see DC, at least old DC, as being Southern, but of course in a very different way. And it's a place that is Southern, but it's because it's the capital, there's been sort of painstaking efforts, I think, to make it less so, which is why it's sort of in between. Yeah. So it's a large region. I think the most controversial thing, I think, is just as I think the Deep South is part of the Circum-Caribbean, I think the Caribbean is part of the South in terms of how it was constituted.
Yeah. Absolutely. Especially if you think about Mobile in New Orleans, So you grew up transiting locales, and, sometimes you were in predominantly white spaces, sometimes you were in predominantly Black spaces. And I'm curious, being a Black person, having more intimate experience with whiteness, I imagine being sometimes the only Black friend in a room or in a group. How has that contributed to your understanding, of the world, and also the inverse, right, of like coming back home, so to speak, and then bringing that white world with you?
Yeah. When I was about, I would say, I think 15, I pretty much decided that my friendships with white people were going to be individual and my social experiences were going to be Black. And it was largely because I just, for lack of, more nuanced language, I just found white people collectively so exhausting that I couldn't do it.
Yeah.
I mean, and it really, like, it's, just feeling like I didn't want to have to be on guard socially constantly, so that my individual friendships with white people, those were friendships that were, we had shared interests. We talked through things. We talked through difficult issues. I could talk about race and develop real intimacy with individual white people. And I think in some ways that was my dad, who was my adoptive father, but him being a white person who's very, very critical of racism and didn't want me actually to date white boys because he was worried that I would be a victim of racism. It was like I loved and love, he's passed, but I love him so much that I never had the experience of thinking, like I never questioned the capacity to have deep closeness and intimacy and family with white people. But what I did have in these spaces that were classist and elitist and also racist, I did have a kind of general skepticism that was learned and they had earned. It's so interesting, I think partially because of my family and where my family was from, especially being in the Northeast. Those moments that you experience where people are sort of want to sort of question your authenticity, like racial authenticity as a Black person, like, because you've been, you went to this school or you live in this neighborhood. I have to say it didn't faze me. Like I would just sort of be like, whatever. I also learned early that people are often projecting in those moments. So I don't know. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, it's something I feel like is so different in every situation. There's no way to even talk about it broadly, but right. I was just curious. I had a moment when we moved from Los Angeles to Atlanta, and I started my first day of school. I remember this girl came up to me and she was like, "You bilingual?" And I was thinking, "No, I don't speak Spanish." I was like, "What are you?" She was like, "You speak Black and white."
Biracial. Oh yeah, right. Oh my God, that is cute. That reminded me of, and I had, one of my cousins once asked, "Do you go to speech class?" And I was like, "No, I just been up in Massachusetts."
Yeah.
That's all.
You've talked about your father, and I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about what he taught you, particularly in relationship to whiteness and your political reality.
It's pretty remarkable when I think about it, but he's the person who taught me about, what we now term, thanks to Moya Bailey, misogynoir. But he's the person who would say, look, there are people who are in particular going to underestimate you and deny you opportunity because you are Black and a woman. Your job is to not be defined by their bigotry, or he would say their racism, their sexism, and my mother was much less interested in putting pressure on me in terms of my work having to be meaningful for some, larger goal of liberation. But he was like, the work that you do has to be in service in some way. He was like, at some point, you have to go back and live in Alabama. You need to be there. He would say, like, the point of education is more than anything about the quality of life it affords you. And he would talk about, so he was a Jewish man, but he grew up poor, sleeping on the sofa in the living room, and kind of just got to college by happenstance when City College was basically open admission. And so then had experienced this sort of bounty of education out of nowhere as changing his whole life and making him the person he became. And so for him, it's like it changed the very person he could be. And so he emphasized that it was so much about experiences and expansion. And that in some ways was like my grandmother, there was a lot of thought about, the importance of knowing and becoming and exploring more than a certain kind of attainment. And he also, and I think this was really important, is that he loves Black people deeply. He never wanted me to have any negative conceptions of my biological father. So I did.
I'm sorry. This is where I interrupt and play a joke about daddy issues. I'm sorry. Keep going.
So he is really kind of a remarkable human being. I don't quite know how he came to be in the world.
How did he come to be your father?
So, this is again one of those things that gets shrouded in kind of not secrecy, but a lack of memory. but my mother left my biological father when she found out she was pregnant. She said he was too authoritarian and went back home. I mean, she was like a feminist without calling herself a feminist. She was like, I'm not staying involved with a man who's trying to give people orders. And she went home to Alabama and got a job working at Miles College, which is a historically Black college in Fairfield, Alabama, at the new teacher orientation. My dad was there too. He had finished graduate school and, inspired by the movement and by the 68 Olympics, was like, I gotta, I need to find my way south and figure out how to do something meaningful with my life. And they met at the new faculty orientation. Now, my father says that he just thought she was so beautiful. And he was like, oh, but she's going to be stupid, but because she's so gorgeous, because he was a complete sexist back then. One of his friends just texted me and was like, he told you that story. That was a lie. Everybody knew she was a genius when she first walked in the room. So who knows what really happened? I mean, literally read that in my book and was like, that was a lie he told you. So who knows? Because he was there too. So they met at the new faculty orientation. He asked her out. She said, I like you, but I'm pregnant. And he was like, I don't care. So that's the story. So he's the only father I ever had, knew. Yeah.
That's amazing. What a blessing.
It's a blessing. Yeah.
This is a slight pivot, but I want to ask, how did your mother settle on your name?
Oh, this is a great question. My mother, I have no idea. My mother doesn't know. No, let me tell you, when I had Diallo, which I don't know, because the world knows as Freeman, because that's where he goes by publicly. So when I had Diallo and I was asking my mother stuff about having a baby, and she kept being, I don't remember. And then eventually my aunt was like, stop asking her. She doesn't know. We took it. I was like, what do you mean? She said, we were taking care of you while she was going off trying to have a revolution. And I was like, okay. And I don't mean my mother wasn't neglectful, but
my
mother really was one of these people who thought that they were going to win.
Yeah.
I asked my mother, for example, I was like, did my name come from Kwanzaa? No, I knew East African people. Okay, but did they tell you? No, I don't know. I don't remember. They were, it just, and that's sort of where you go. And that's sort of the end of the conversation. So all that to say, I don't know. No, but I love it.
No, I mean, it's a fantastic name. Do you have a middle name?
I do not. So when I was baptized, which is also a sort of complicated story, but I was baptized. Actually, I was born in Alabama. I was baptized up in Boston, even though we lived in Alabama at the time, because my godmother was a principal of a school that the Archdiocese of Boston had given over to Black people to make a community school. She gave me a saint's name, which was for Saint Clare, but in Italian, Chiara.
Mm-hmm.
And then later, when aunt said, "Oh, I wanted you to be named Nia," so I sort of added Nia on my own when I was about 11. Which points to the Kwanzaa thing, but my mother insisted it wasn't a Kwanzaa name. I put Kiara in when I was younger and sometimes Nia, but I do not have a middle name, formally speaking.
Okay.
And I have another saint's name when I was confirmed as I didn't mention, I come from a Catholic family.
Okay.
And so that's why we have saints' names. And so my other saint's name is Perpetua.
I love that.
From when I was 16. She's African. You know,
I love all of those. It's very like, it all tells a story, right?
A lot of stories. Yeah.
There's this line in the opening, the dedication to Salt Eaters by Toni K. Bambara, in which she writes, "Having come upon me daydreaming in the middle of the kitchen floor, she mopped around me."
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
Which is just such a layered and loving articulation of the kind of freedom and respect her mother had for her, the freedom she hoped for her and the respect she had. And I love it because it has resonance for me, and I'm curious if it has resonance for you as a mother or as a daughter.
Both, and also as a granddaughter. So one of the things about my grandmother is that the two people she let stay in the bed, and, you know, she conventionally, as a Southern Black woman, did not believe in people staying in the bed, were my mother and then me. And it had everything to do with reading. This idea that as long as I was reading, I could be mopped around was absolutely the sensibility, right? But I do also remember like feeling in my own way put upon by the domestic norms of Black womanhood. Mm-hmm. And that's why I loved learning about Ida B. Wells, who didn't like to clean up very much either. But also, you know what? I want to take that back a little bit because my mother did have the very strong sense that it was really important that I be capable of taking care of myself. Mm-hmm. And so she was not, she would be horrified to hear that I said this publicly. And I will say, somebody will tell her, because people always go back to my mother and tell her everything I say. When I said I wanted to be a writer, she'd be like, "That's not a job." I was reading all the time, and yet I believed her. Oh, they must, I don't know how they're doing this. This is not a job. You know, it was like, you have to have a profession. Mm-hmm. And, you know, being an academic seemed like the closest thing to doing that. So there was both this investment in the dreaming, but also some pressure for a certain kind of practicality that came more from my mother than from my grandmother. My grandmother was not, you know, she wanted her kids, and probably, you know, in some ways this was shaped by the circumstances of her life. She wanted her children to be educated, but she wasn't sort of pushing for a certain kind of professional trajectory by any means. It was just, you have to go to school, you know. You
dedicate May We Forever Stand to your mother. And yes, you say that she taught you to know and love your people. What do you mean by that?
So my mother has always refused any deficit accounts of anything associated with Black people. At every turn, she talks about the resilience, the dignity, the building, the creation, the struggle. And I didn't realize how important that would be for me, especially as a scholar, because it shaped the way I looked for things, right? Like, because if you presume certain kinds of deficiencies, then you just ignore entire bodies of knowledge. When I was writing that book, and I spent so much time looking through the records of Black schools to see how people used Lift Every Voice and Sing in school rituals. And when I looked in the archives in HBCUs, that are just have these incredible archives that people just don't use. And in Black studies in particular, for some time now, there's been a pretty robust discourse about, you know, the absence in the archives, the materials we don't have, the gaps. But if you actually value Black institutions, you know, there are some gaps, but there's a lot that has been preserved that scholars just don't go to because they don't know that it exists, right? And don't value the institutions and communities enough to assume that there are things that exist that are out there that aren't in Ivy League libraries. She taught me to value institutions that so often in my line of business get devalued, and communities.
I want to ask you about your relationship to your grandmother and great-grandmother now that they've passed, because you've talked about how they continue to be a presence in your life, and just wondering if you could share, how they show up for you.
I mean, my grandmother is in every single thing that I do. A woman who spent most of the years of her life experiencing either Jim Crow or the vestiges of Jim Crow, spent her whole life in Alabama except for a year in DC and a year or a year and a half in Nashville, and was a daily reader and had 12 children and worked as a domestic and then worked in the hospital. And so she was in many ways sort of amongst the most marginalized, and was also completely headstrong and outspoken and had incredible self-regard and socialized us into it. And so her self-regard made her this incredible critical lens about the world. And it's something that I have tried to emulate and I deeply admired. And I, in this work, I also tried to take that relationship I have with her and also think through the women who came before on both sides, going as far back as this ancestor who was, by virtue of one document says, was born in Maryland in 1769, named Easter or Esther. So, from the very early 1700s, these Black folks who worked to build the country economically, probably in tobacco fields, and then who witnessed, this woman, she witnesses the nation becoming a country, formally speaking, right? When she's a little girl and is outside of contemplation of what it means to be part of this country. And I want to always keep that lens because we always have people who are inside literally, but treated as outsiders, treated as inconsequential, treated as unworthy of consideration. And it's just a matter of values. I try to keep that frame of reference as central to whatever I try to explore intellectually and artistically. So yeah, they're always there.
That's really beautiful. Back to your children.
Yes.
I imagine that they must be teaching you all the time, but I would be curious today, what would you say have been, some of your greatest lessons from them?
Oh, gosh. Well, one is that there are actually some inborn talents because there are things, there are things where I'm like, how do you know how to do that? And I really resisted the idea that there are some sort of gifts that we're born with, and then you have children. And not only do you realize there are some gifts that people are actually born with, but also people come with personalities. And, your job is to nurture them. Right. And so I think one of the things I've most learned from my kids is the ways in which they've said no to me when it contradicted who they took themselves to be. It's such an incredible gift because it's so much better to see a person who feels, fulfilled and comfortable in their skin than someone who feels as though they have to fit a cookie cutter image that someone else has projected upon them. I mean, it makes you feel much better about parenting to do the former. Talking to them, their perspectives, like Issa is so good at being a friend. Like he does the work of supporting his friends on a regular basis. And I learned so much from him about what it means to actually be in active relationship with someone on a daily basis, like not this thing that so often, and that we do where we'll talk to someone like once a month or every 3 months. I've been so busy, and you catch up. Like now he's like, this is the day-to-day work. And I actually, interestingly enough, I learned so much from Diallo about the kind of joy of being an intellectual. You get Like today, he and I had a conversation for 90 minutes where he's telling me about this story that he might write, but it's more like a journey through his imagination. And, and he laughs and he smiles and like, it's so, and I'm like, yeah, that's the thing of where it feels good. Not everything is like just instrumental. I'm going to write this thing or I'm going to complete this thing, but it just feels good to think and explore and dream.
I asked Jeff Chang this in our last episode about whether or not his sons have been taking notes. I was curious if you're seeing that. Like, do they respect your work or are they just dismissing you as a boomer, which is incorrect, but people like to do that these days.
No, you know what? My kids are so sweet. They are so affirming about my work and that it's sort of like unnerving.
Mm.
I mean, Issa was like, the week South to America came out, he was like, you're going to make the New York Times bestseller list. And I was like, no way. And he's like, no, he's like, I feel it. I feel it this time, the energy. He's like, it's going to happen. And I was like, who is this kid?
How old is he?
15.
Wow.
And then when it did, he was like, I told you. But also he's watching. He watches, he follows the social media stuff. I do think that there are times when they're like, nobody wants to work as hard as you do, like ever. But they're also, particularly about the things that are important to them, they will spend time on, like they treat their avocations like work, which is probably because those will probably be the things that become their work. Yeah. So that'd be interesting to see.
I want to ask a question about language. There are ways that you talk about Blackness, the Black vernacular, Black grammar are incredibly powerful. And you offer a stylistic note in South to America, which is something that I've been thinking about a lot. We've been thinking about as an organization. And, so I want to read it and then talk to you a little bit about it. So the passage is, I have long thought Black in reference to people should be capitalized. Finally, the style guides agree with me. But I also capitalize white in this book. That is less common. I do so because the categories Black and white were made together. They are strangely symbiotic, opposing yet intimate. Historically, white was a term reserved for those who could possibly be full citizens and members of the country. Black was for the ultimate others, held down or at the margins. I also capitalize indigenous, a people of many nations named Indian by European error, who were colonized, expelled, robbed, and shuttered from their native lands. Generations have expanded and challenged the meanings of race that were created by colonialism. Nevertheless, in this country's history, Black and white have never been mere adjectives, and indigenous, a global term, is specific in this nation. These are identity categories that were made by law, custom, policies, protest, economic relations, and perhaps most potently, culture. Politeness, grammar rules, and political pieties aside, this strikes me as a simple truth that ought to be acknowledged. I didn't make the rules. I am trying to tell them to you. So I love that.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. There's this conversation, right, about lower and uppercase Blackness, not making the rules, but understanding them. And I personally was slow to capitalizing my B's, from early college on. And I think in some ways I was trying to downplay the acknowledged artificiality of race and also not wanting to put this thing in the center that I hadn't created. But over time, I also have shifted my thinking. And, at BlackStar, we capitalize the B in Black, we capitalize the B in Brown, we capitalize the I in Indigenous. And it's because, much like our Americanness, right, it is a real thing. And it should be respected as such, right? So, what prompted you to include that? What has shaped your thinking on this?
Well, I will say it was really the house style of HarperCollins is not to capitalize white. And previously, I've had backs and forths, which I've lost about this question. Like in May We Forever Stand, and the B in Black's not capitalized. It still bugs me. That was the house style of that press, UNC. But at HarperCollins, they said, listen, if you want to capitalize white, you just need to tell us why. Right. And so that's why I wrote the style note. And it just seems so odd to me that all this suffering is because white was such a big thing, and then we're not going to capitalize it. Right. I mean, it feels kind of fictional. Like, we're just going to pretend like this isn't really what white means. We know what it means. And so I felt like, especially in this book, where I'm trying to explain the structure and the roots of this order that we live with, the way that the South sort of animated what would happen in this country, I wanted the kind of honesty of the capitalization of white. I don't know if I'll always do it, but I just could not do it in this book. I also sometimes feel like there are ways, and I think this is particularly sort of folks on the liberal to left spectrum who experience sort of making white a lowercase as a kind of self-effacement, like, oh, we're not, that's, your identity, of course, needs to be capitalized. But again, it feels like a gesture that doesn't carry much weight, because everybody knows that whiteness is the sort of the most powerful gear in this society. And so I understand the sentiment. The sentiment is not as important as the truth. That's just my feeling now. And at the time, I don't know, but I don't know. Because my big thing is that language changes, it grows. I'm very uncomfortable with the sort of hard, fast, absolute rules about things. Besides, I don't want anybody who's not Black using the N-word. But beyond that, I want to be open to language shifts.
That is a conversation for another time. But I'm also sort of like really apprehensive about codifying things. But I also appreciate, particularly now, because we're not writing necessarily on paper, so things can change on a website. You know what I mean? It's like we very much can have these shifting definitions and guides. And I really appreciate you posing it in that way. I mean, we're literally putting it in our style guide at BlackStar, so I appreciate it. I'm curious for you, what's next on the horizon, and if there's anything you haven't attempted professionally that you'd like to experience in addition to, you talked about writing a book of fiction, but is there anything else that you're looking to do?
Yeah. I mean, I obviously have a ton more books that I'm trying to write, but I would love to curate a visual art exhibition in a way that could be coordinated with writing and language, right? So in a way, like whether it's a show or whether it's sort of pairing poems with photographs or paintings, that's something that I would really love to do at some point. The thing that I think I want to do, but that I'm also kind of afraid of, I would love to sort of figure out how to do writing retreats, how to host them. I'm a little afraid of it, but I think about it all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, leaning into fear. Woof. Are there other... we've talked about your family a lot, but do you have any personal luminaries or intellectual North Stars?
I mean, there's always Morrison and also Thelonious Monk, aesthetically speaking. But there's something that's happening with both of them aesthetically around being elliptical and repetition and variations on a theme, and the sort of relationship between constraint and freedom that shapes so much of what I'm trying to do, like discipline and then freedom and the dangers in both. Like that's a thing that is sort of always underneath what I'm trying to figure out as an aesthetic question. So yeah, there we go. I'll regret not saying 10, 11 more people, but that's the most concise form.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Thank you, Imani.
Thank you. This has been a great conversation. I'm so grateful.
Thank you, Imani, Kiera, Nia, Perpetua, Perry.
Oh, yeah, Perpetua. Can't forget that. Oh, you got them all. And I used to write it like that, too, the way we do. Like with all the extra words.
Oh, absolutely.
Gas names. Okay. All right. Bye.
All right. Bye. Follow Imani Perry on Instagram and Twitter at Imani Perry. To subscribe to her newsletter, Unsettled Territory, visit newsletters.theatlantic.com/unsettled-territory. You can purchase her new book, South to America, at harpercollins.com. This season of Mini Lumens is brought to you by Open Society Foundations. It is produced by BlackStar Projects in partnership with Rowhome Productions. The host and executive producer of Mini Lumens is me, Maori Karmael Holmes. Our producer is Imani Leonard. Associate producers are Irit Reinheimer and Farah Rahaman. Managing producer is Alex Lewis. Executive editor is John Myers. Our music supervisor is David Little Dave Adams, BlackStar's Music and Cinema Fellow, supported by the Pop Culture Collaborative. Our theme song was composed by Vijay Mohan and remixed by David Little Dave Adams. Sending you light, and see you next time.